right, we're just slowly letting everyone enter the chat, and we are about to get started with the FoRēL webinar, Female Religious Leadership, Interfaith Perspectives. Thank you all for coming. All right, and I have the go-ahead to start, so we'll go now. Welcome again to the second ever FoRēL webinar. FoRēL is an international network for female religious leaders of different faith traditions. We believe that our societies need more female leaders. FoRēL. We open up spaces to listen to women, to learn about their experiences as leaders, and to engage in real conversations and connect with each other. Today, we will be discussing the theme of female religious leadership with 4 leaders from different faith traditions. This panel consists of women from 3 of the Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Our discussion today, at least prior to the question and answer session, will focus primarily on the Abrahamic traditions, but we are and aspire to be an interfaith network open to people of all faiths, traditions, and spiritual understandings. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself to the rest of the webinar attendees. You can write something like your name, the country that you're in right now, your religious affiliation, and maybe one fun fact about yourself. This is a great way to get to know who's in the webinar. And be sure, if you write this, to make sure that your settings are set to everyone and not a direct message or a direction just to the panelists. Also, if you have questions or comments at any point throughout the webinar, please write them in the chat addressed to everyone. Later, during the Q&A session, we will pose some of your questions to the panelists. If our first webinar is any indicator, we probably won't have time to get to every single question. For that reason, we've added an optional meet and greet Zoom meeting after the webinar. That meeting will be unrecorded. You will be able to activate your cameras and microphones and interact with each other and further discuss some of the topics that came up today. The link to the meet and greet will be posted in the chat now, I believe from Natia, and she will post it again at the end of the webinar. Just copy and paste that link into your web browser to enter the separate meet and greet room after the webinar. This meet and greet will last about 20 to 30 minutes. It'll be very casual and hopefully fun as we can be online. My name is Kieran Wirtz. I'm a member of the FoRēL organizational core group. I also serve at the European Baptist Federation in research and advocacy in the areas of human rights and freedom of religion or belief. I'm currently completing my MA in interreligious studies with an emphasis on philosophy of religion at the University of Bonn in Germany. I was asked to give a short reflection to introduce the topic of female religious leadership to start us off today. I am currently working on a research project on the traditions of religious leadership in the Abrahamic faiths. One of my core questions for the project is, what is the historical and theological background of these everyday roles of priest, pastor, or imam that we see in contemporary society? It turns out this core question gets at a pretty complicated matter, what the background of these traditions are. However, the ancient Jewish poetics of the shepherd serve as an instructive starting point to better understand religious leadership in these traditions. Moses, David, and Abraham, all of these religious figures were also shepherds, literal shepherds of sheep. God in the tradition is often described as the shepherd of the people of Israel. Yes, as I said, in this poetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible. For Christians, Jesus is often identified as the good shepherd, the one who gives his life over for his sheep. After his death and resurrection in the Gospel of John, we see Jesus commission the Apostle Peter also as a kind of shepherd. He asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me, Peter?" To which Peter answers yes. And Jesus responds, "As a result of that, feed my sheep." The Hadith also attribute this saying to the Prophet Muhammad: "All of you are shepherds, and each of you are responsible for your flock." By these accounts, religious leadership is very much about care and service to the community of faith, as well as about guiding and pointing the flock back to their God, their shepherd. The word pastor, a term often used for congregational leaders in Christianity, is simply the Latin word for shepherd. Shepherds of sheep, the literal kind, are traditionally, but not necessarily, men. If you ask if a woman could perform the task of a shepherd, almost anyone would say yes. And many women are in fact shepherds. It is just traditionally, somehow, shepherding has somehow been considered a thing that men do. But what do Abraham, Moses, David, Jesus, the 12 apostles, bishops, and the Pope all have in common? Well, they are all metaphorically described at some point as shepherds. They're also all men. God, this ultimate shepherd in this ancient Jewish poetic tradition, I'm going to tell you a secret, is not a man. Almost any theologian in any of these traditions will tell you that God is God beyond all human conceptions of gender and sex. Famously, the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches do not ordain women as priests. Protestants have only begun to sometimes ordain women as ministers or pastors within the past 100 years or so. It is a similarly recent development that women have had the opportunity to become rabbis in some Jewish traditions and communities. Most Muslims do not consider women eligible for the role of imam, with some exceptions. Why is this? Why are women traditionally excluded from these roles? I argue that the central question of female ordination is a question of whether the historical exclusion of women from the spiritual offices is a question of either A, theological necessity, or B, cultural accident. In the antique world, there were lots of things that women couldn't do. The Greco-Roman common sense opinion was that women were deficient versions of men. They were similar to men in a lot of ways, but qualitatively worse. This was literally Aristotle's definition of women. But it wasn't just the Greeks. If you look at a lot of ancient sources, scriptural and non-scriptural, you'll often see women, children, slaves, and livestock listed together, always together in a list. Why is this? The answer is that because they were all considered part of the same legal and ontological category, property. There were men, and then there were men's property, and to that belonged women, children, slaves, and livestock. But while this was the common street level view of women, it is certainly not considered the correct theological view of women in Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. Genesis 1, a sacred text in both Judaism and Christianity, weaves the tale of the creation of the world. And I quote, "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness.' So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them." This understanding of the creation narrative and the origins of Adam and Eve, man and woman, are also echoed in the Quran. The theological term for this anthropology is known in the Christian tradition as the imago Dei. Men and women, both and equally, are images of the invisible God. This notion was wildly countercultural in a world that viewed women as deficient men, bad copies, property, literal objects. You see bold declarations of the equality, dignity, and power of women throughout the scriptural accounts of all three Abrahamic religions. Some example of female religious leadership in these accounts include Deborah, who was named as a prophetess and judge of Israel, a military and political leader in the book of Judges. Many of Jesus's closest followers and confidants were also women, Mary Magdalene being the most famous example. We see in the Acts of the Apostles and the Christian epistles that women had significant leadership roles in the early Christian communities. Some women also served as the financial benefactors of these communities. It is frequently emphasized that spiritual gifts were poured out upon women, that they could act as prophets and serve as deacons and leaders. And finally, there were many female family members and close associates of the Prophet Muhammad who were very active in politics, scholarship, economic activities, military sometimes, and religious leadership. Both men and women are considered equally servants of God, and the Quran takes many stances on the political and social rights of women that were radically progressive in the context of 7th century Arabia. Indeed, the theological tradition of the three Abrahamic religions afforded women much greater dignity, freedom, and respect than the surrounding cultures of the ancient world, all frequently and radically proclaimed the equality of all persons, male and female, before God. The history of how women have been excluded from the formal spiritual offices such as the priest, the pastor, the rabbi, or the imam, is a long and complex history. There are many perspectives on how and why this came to be, and perhaps some of them have a lot of validity. Many of us pose this question within our respective faith traditions. Why can't women be priests, deacons, preachers, pastors, apostles, prophets, rabbis, imams, theologians, or leaders? And we often receive this answer, well, because they are women, as if that settles the issue. Maybe we'll continue to ask, what do you mean by that, with this imaginary interlocutor? And they might answer, well, traditionally, women have never served in these roles. Yes, but why? We would ask. As far as I have experienced it, my opinion, this question cannot be answered in a way which doesn't somehow rely on an assumption of some fundamental inferiority of women. Such an assumption is quite in conflict with the core claims present in the sacred texts of the Abrahamic traditions, proclaiming the dignity and equality of men and women. For centuries, the spiritual offices were closed to most women across the world most of the time. This is changing. Today, we are speaking with 4 trailblazers in female religious leadership: 1 rabbi, 1 Baptist minister or pastor, 1 female lay leader in the Greek Orthodox Church in the United States, and 1 Muslima scholar who has researched and thought deeply about female leadership in Islam. So, with this short historical and theological reflection behind us, let's turn things over to our panel. I'm excited to hear about their unique experiences and inspiring perspectives on female religious leadership. So now to Leah.
Thank you so much, dear Kiran, for your wonderful introduction and for giving us some historical backgrounds. My name is Leah Schlenke. I'm a Protestant theologian in the Lutheran tradition in Germany. And I'm very excited to be your moderator this evening, or for those who are based in America, this afternoon. I will start with the first round of questions, and I will introduce our panelists to you as we speak and go on. And I will start with Rabbi Melinda Zalma. She is a chaplain and a commander in the US Navy Reserve, but also she is a program director at the Jewish Community Relations Council in New York. She has received her rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, where she also completed her MA in Midrash, which means rabbinic commentary. Rabbi Melinda, we are so excited to have you. And I would like to ask you, after now this kind of more historical focus that we have in Kiran's introduction, what your experiences as a female leader are in your context and in your faith community.
So I just want to clarify, you want to go a little bit of the historical background and some of my experience? Okay, so I am part of the conservative movement, which in Judaism is conservative with a large C, and part of the more liberal side of the Jewish spectrum. I'm not going to go into a full treatise on the differences between the different parts of Judaism, but for conservative Judaism, there is a balance between the commitment to Jewish law and the process of creating Jewish law, and being part of the modern community and taking modern issues into account. And so interacting with the Jewish law with that lens. And that's where the part of women as religious leaders comes in. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was a movement to include women as part of the prayer quorum, the minyan, to be counted in what it takes to say certain prayers in public. So in 1973, the year I was born, very good year, there was a law passed within the conservative movement that women could be counted in prayer quorums, and it was a could. There were those across the board different ways. And I grew up in a synagogue that did count women in the prayer quorum, and women were active participants and leaders of prayer. In Judaism, you do not need to be a rabbi to lead prayer. You need to be well versed in the prayers and a pleasant voice. So women could be prayer leaders and take leadership. And even before women were counted in the quorum, they were taking leadership positions in the lay capacity. women rabbis in the conservative movement came about in 1985, a number of years later, and which was about almost 20 years before I was ordained. And those women were trailblazers and went through a lot of challenges and struggles. And there was, for a long time, a big process in helping congregations open up their views of what it meant to be a rabbi, to include women. Some congregations had an easier time than others. By the time I became a rabbi, it seemed very natural to me, very open. Again, like I said, I grew up in a congregation that was, it was seamless that women were leaders and prayer leaders. So I myself haven't found, so that's why, so I haven't found so many challenges, and it's really a lot of opportunities. For me as a chaplain in the Navy has been extremely interesting, because there are a wide variety of chaplains from a wide variety of spiritual backgrounds, religious backgrounds, including a lot of very small c conservative Christians who in their own denominations do not ordain women. However, when you join the military as a chaplain, you agree to work in a pluralistic environment, which means you will have women subordinate to you and women superior to you in the hierarchy, in the ranks, and women you have to work with, which presents a lot of opportunities for learning amongst colleagues in being able to distinguish between your internal theology and the commitment you have to work with everybody. I have just found it really be a blessing to be a part of those communities, both the military community and my civilian communities. I have served as a rabbi of a congregation, a spiritual leader of a congregation, and also a rabbi in the nonprofit world, making a lot of building a lot of bridges between people and communities.
Thank you so much, Melinda, for sharing both the brief historical sketch and also your personal insights. And as you spoke about leading prayers and the need to adapt the law or work with the law, but also adapt it to the current needs, I was wondering what Dr. Alyaa Ebbiary might think. And I just want to introduce you briefly, Alyaa. Alyaa Ebbiary is an education programs officer at the Faith and Belief Forum in London. And she's also a researcher at SOAS in London, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where she also completed her PhD. Alyaa, I'm delighted to have you, and I would also like to hear your opinion about what female leadership means, especially in Islamic faith communities today.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you for inviting me. First, I'd just like to make clear that I'm not actually a religious faith leader like many of the other women in this panel. I'm a researcher and a community activist, but a lot of my research has been about Muslim women scholars and Muslim women religious leaders. So I'm in here in that capacity as someone who's been observing and researching that topic. Before we can have any kind of discussion or understanding of female religious authority in Islam, we have to clear up two issues. And these issues keep coming up, particularly on discussions of this topic in the West, because we often have some Western-centered and Judeo-Christian assumptions behind the topic. First of all, in the Western world, the role of the imam has become an equivalent of a priest and a rabbi. But in the Islamic world, it's not strictly speaking an exact equivalent in terms of religious authority. It's become a pragmatic equivalent for Muslim minorities in the West in terms of civil society organizing and representation. Imams of mosques have taken on a community leadership position, which they don't necessarily have in parts of the Muslim majority world. So just to give a bit of an explanation of what an imam is, we can say there's two types of imam. Let's say imam with a capital I and imam with a little I. Imam in the Arabic language means someone in front, so someone who is at the front of a prayer congregation, who is leading that prayer. So an imam with a small I, if I can call it that, is someone who is in any particular context leading Islamic ritual congregational worship. So that person, imam with a small I, may not be qualified in any way in terms of religious learning or religious authority. So, for example, there are lots of mosques in very far-flung, isolated parts of the Muslim world. Let's say you live in a very, a small isolated village or a hamlet or a nomadic camp, and people are getting together to say their congregational ritual prayer. Anybody can be the imam. So it could be the local cobbler, the blacksmith, whoever, they may have another job, and they may just be nominated to lead the prayer at a particular time because they have memorized a large portion of the Quran, the Islamic holy book, or because they are considered a very upright and honest member of the community. So a lot of imams in a lot of Muslim congregations around the Muslim world haven't necessarily had any training or religious authority behind that role. They're just leading the prayer in a particular community. So imam with a capital I, if I can call it that way, is the role that has now become a kind of community leader in a lot of mosques in the Western world, where a mosque is considered like a community hub, it's considered an organization, an institution, and the imam has in a way become a salaried full-time leader of that institution. That is not a given throughout the Muslim world. In large mosques in big cities, yes, there is a full-time imam who's considered the leader of that institution, but that's not a given everywhere. And so what we have now, particularly among Muslim communities in the West, which is a context I've grown up in here in the UK, you have a context where the imam has become a role that it's not just someone leading the prayers, it's someone who's become a mediator, a counsellor, a registrar for marriages, somebody who undertakes funeral rites, somebody who deals with legal disputes, somebody who may need to represent the community on the local council or in interfaith activities, and so many other roles that may not have existed in the role of the imam in a lot of Muslim majority countries or historically. So having said that, I'm just, have I got a little bit more time? Can I speak for another couple of minutes? So yeah, just to give you a little bit of
ground.
Just to give you a little bit of context, the religious hierarchy in Islamic tradition, particularly in the Sunni tradition, is not very rigid. It's not very, it's not particularly clear and hierarchical. So you have roles such as the mufti, who is a legal scholar, qualified to give fatwas. You have a faqih, who is a jurisprudent or a legal expert. You have a mufassir, who's an exegete. You have Sufi sheikhs or Sufi sheikhas, if you're a female Sufi leader. You have alim and alima, who are Islamic scholars, both male and female. And you have imam. And of all those roles, imam is actually the one with the least authority and clout, if you will. Interestingly, of all the roles I've just mentioned, all of them are open to women. So all the different higher levels of religious authority are open to both men and women. Imam is actually the one with the least authority and the least kind of influence. And that's the only one that traditionally hasn't been open to women. Not because women can't lead prayers. Women all over the Muslim world are leading prayers in small congregations, family congregations, particularly women-only congregations. There hasn't been a precedent, or there hasn't been much of a precedent, this is very disputed, which we can go on to. There hasn't been much of a precedent in Islamic history where women are leading mixed congregational prayers in the mosque. So that's the key point here. That's why you will not find many mosques with an official salaried full-time imam who is female. That's kind of almost non-existent in the Muslim world, but you will find women who are theologians, exegetes, Islamic legal experts, Sufi mystics, religious teachers, other women who have much higher levels of religious authority. Should I stop there, or would you like me to carry on?
Yeah, thank you, Alyaa. I think that's a great background for further discussions. Thank you so much for giving that overview, and also for distinguishing the differences between what we expect in the West, coming from a, well, maybe saying for myself, from a Christian background, and all other structures. That's great. Well, given that this plurality of roles, I was thinking of Spyridoula, who is also a lay leader in the Greek Orthodox Church, and what her position on this, or what her point of view is. But first of all, let me introduce her briefly. Spyridoula Fotnis is one of our core group members of FoRēL, and she is a well, as I said already, a Greek Orthodox Christian. She is working as a coordinator of programs and special assistant to the director at the Department of Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations at the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. What a title. I love that. And yeah, she did her BA in New York, where she's also based. And I'm really happy, Spyridoula, that you are joining us, and I would love to hear your perspective on female leadership in your Greek Orthodox Christian context.
Thanks, Leah, and thank you to everyone else. I've already learned so much. I'm excited to continue the conversation. As Leah said, I am based in the States. I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Christian community, and that definitely plays a role in all those different pieces. So as was mentioned, I come from a tradition where females are not necessarily these roles and things that we're talking about, that women are not ordained into the priesthood. And that's something that has been talked about. But what is really awesome, and I think really important to note too, is that women still play an incredible role in the church. And we all know this in our different contexts and faith communities, women are always present in different ways. And I know in some of the conversations we've had too, it's like sometimes those things are vocalized and sometimes they're not, and sometimes they're a bit more hidden. But one of the things that I think is really interesting to note in the Orthodox Christian tradition, if you walk into an Orthodox Christian church anywhere in the world, when you enter, what we have is called the iconostas, which is like a stand that is a screen between the altar and the main part of the church. And in the back is what we call the platitera, or it's a huge icon of the Virgin Mary. And her arms are open like this, and her body is basically taking up the whole back of the church. So as soon as you enter, the first person you really see is a woman, if you're looking straight back into the church. And so platitera, durano in Greek, means like wider or bigger than the heavens, right? She's beyond the heavens and is kind of this huge role that as Orthodox Christians, we venerate and respect her. We don't worship her because we only worship God in the Trinity. But because for us, she is the mother of God, she plays an incredible role and is really our mother. So with that background, like women are such a vital part of our tradition. And as Kieran mentioned in her introduction, even speaking as a Christian, like women played an important role in the ministry and witness of Christ and his work. And for us, we just celebrated the presentation of Christ to the temple after 40 days. And in one part of the passage, the prophetess Anna is spoken about, as after she is seeing Christ, she witnesses to the people around her and preaches that Christ is here, the Messiah has come, right? So from the beginning, and my footnotes in the Bible mention, from the beginning, women are already spreading the good news as a Christian perspective. So even if we don't see necessarily today in the church where I work and where I am as an Orthodox Christian here in the US in my local parishes, my priest is not a female, but that's okay. That's where conversations we're continuing to have. And I mean, we do ask why that is and trying to understand our tradition more. And I know there's different, in the early church, there was a woman diaconate, and I'm not going to speak to that because I don't know enough about it, but I think there's something to be said about women's ministry and women ministering to one another, and also for the whole body of the church, learning and growing from that. And I'll briefly mention as a closing that, as Leah said, I am blessed to work at the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, which is really the headquarters, so to speak, for all Greek Orthodox parishes here in the US. And that has really challenge, but also have been really a blessing for me as a young female in the church. And I'll definitely go into that more later.
Thank you, Spyridoula. Speaking about female ministry, well, we have one female pastor here on board, which is Mira Ungewitter. And she is a Baptist pastor from Vienna in Austria. She has studied theology in Bonn and Elstal in Germany. And she's also part of the Austrian Women's Network sorority. And as a footnote, she's the author of the book Road Trip with God, and a new book on feminism and faith is on the way. We're really looking forward to that. But first of all, and before that book is published, we are happy to have you and also your perspectives as a female pastor in today's society.
Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. It's already 7 o'clock in Vienna and it's Corona and I'm tired. So, and at first I will do the most German thing you can do. I will excuse myself for my bad English. Yes, where should start? So again, I'm happy to be here as a pastor and I'm so happy to hear all your stories now. And where should I start? Maybe with the beginning. I grew up in a with a Baptist mother and agnostic father, so I already had different different influence when I grew up. I went to a Catholic school. I studied theology, but I grew up in a free church Baptist background with different influences. And I became a pastor 5 years ago. And now I live as a Baptist pastor and also as free church Protestant pastor in a Catholic background in Austria. About female leadership. So, of course, there are no female priests in the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. There are women serving in the church, also in high positions, but not as a priest. The Protestants are difficult. So in the most Lutheran churches, there are already female pastors. In some free churches, also in the Pentecost or some churches we would today say they are conservative, there were already women preaching 100 years ago. In the Baptist unions all around the world, there are some female pastors allowed, and another church, maybe could be the Baptist church just around the street, there are no women allowed to preach. This is because at the Baptist, we are believing that every church could decide about their point of faith. Can you say that? So there's a tolerance. So that's good on one hand, and it's difficult on the other hand. Especially in Austria, we have the situation that I'm allowed to be a pastor of my church, but not a pastor of the union. At the same way, I'm also in the leadership of the union. So you are confused, I'm confused. And but this is like part of the Christian community. It's not so easy, and maybe so far.
Thank you for sharing, Mira. As we spoke before while we prepared for this webinar, you mentioned that you had a very long day today, Mira, with a lot of male colleagues and very male-dominated conversations. And so I would be interested to hear from you what you think are the challenges today for female religious leaders in your particular context.
Oh yeah, where should I start?
Apparently we have a connection problem
about female leadership, and everybody was like, could we maybe talk not so much about it? So I'm always confused why so many people are so afraid of it. and not just in a Christian religion, like all over the world. Like we said before, there's like this universal religion about patriarchy, and this is why I would love to talk with all about you. Why are so many different in all the religions? And at this point, when it's about women and women leadership, like all the people who are like an opposite come together and are agreed, no, there we come to the point, no, they are not allowed, or often they are not allowed, or allow women in leadership. And so for me in Austria, I can just tell for myself that I will fight for more women in leadership in my church, in the Baptist Union, and maybe so far.
Thank you, Mira. Melinda, when you were talking before about your experiences in the Navy, you also mentioned that there were quite a bit of men who had problems with women who were superior. Maybe you want to reflect a bit more on challenges together with us.
So that's within the military, because of its unique character that you're bringing together people of chaplains of many different religions with many different beliefs. And it's really for me, it's from the outside, because I am a rabbi, so I'm a Jewish female ordained clergy. Conservative Christians have no issues with me because it's not their religion. I have witnessed the tension between conservative male colleagues and female colleagues, chaplains, because it is their religion and they're interpreting the same text, all of the same text, not just half. So, and I've also heard of some beautiful experiences where, actually this came up recently in a discussion, where one female chaplain, she was the command chaplain, had a male chaplain from a more conservative faith under her leadership. And actually, as he was departing the command, he said, I've always been uncomfortable. And for her, he'd been completely respectful, but very good working relationship. But he said he'd always had an issue internally. And so they sat down and talked about it and opened him up. But he was already acting. She had no idea there was an issue, but he felt comfortable to talk about it and explore it, and really to be able to hold the internal beliefs with the acknowledgement that we live out differently, but as the chaplain corps, we come together working for a common goal. I also, if I can add, I wanted to give a little bit larger picture about Judaism in general and women leadership, just as an overview, because that's not my expertise since I'm a conservative, but I do know within as a general, very broad spectrum, there's the liberal side, which you'll hear with the Reform Jews, Reconstructionists, and Renewal. The Reform movement is the largest of those three, and they've had women rabbis since the 70s, and have always been, they're much more oriented in what the community in modern times versus what halacha, what Jewish law says. They keep the spirit of it. And then they have on the other side of the conservative movement is the Orthodox, which is very broad. It was very modern Orthodox, which in the past 5 to 10 years have ordained is not quite the right word, but have recognized women leaders. Some are called Rabbat, female of rabbi. Some are called Maharat, which is another term of leadership, and who are starting to lead communities and congregations. But there's always been women scholars and leaders and throughout Jewish history. As you move farther to the right, on the Orthodox, there's less public roles for women, though there's a lot of internal leadership and women's organizations within even the more quite ultra-Orthodox, as we call it, within Judaism. So there's a wide spectrum, and also there's a wide idea of what a leader means. I think that's one of the things that we've all been touching on, is the different ways that we can be leaders. whether there's a title or not.
Yeah, thank you, Melinda, for pointing to that aspect. What is a leader actually? What kind of dimensions do we have for religious leadership? And that's a question that I would like to pose to you also, Alyaa, because you had mentioned that in your research you found out that there's a growth in female religious leadership, but also you made very clear at the beginning of this webinar that we have to distinguish and maybe get rid of our perception if there's no female imam, there's no female leader. And maybe you would like to give us, to elaborate a bit more on women and religious leadership from what you've learned in your research.
So I've been very lucky during my research, and also as a student of female religious teachers, to get to know and befriend a number of Muslim women scholars who have the title of alima, which means female scholar, or sheikha, which is a more senior Islamic scholar. And there is a history, just to mention, there is a history throughout in the Islamic in the Islamic past there is a consistent pattern of female religious scholars and female religious teachers. However, most modern Muslims today wouldn't be able to name many of them. It's not something that's there's not a very strong consciousness of that history of female religious leadership and scholarship in the modern Muslim kind of imagination. However, there is a lot of work being done to sort of uncover that history, and a lot of historians and writers are now trying to bring that to the fore, which is giving a lot of motivation, inspiration for modern young Islamic female scholars, especially the ones that I've been talking to. So in my conversations with them over the years, they're very confident and they're very proud to be taking the vocational and spiritual route that they've taken. Many of them will, however, privately discuss some of the difficulties of trying to carve out a religious vocation in the Muslim community, partly because there's not that many precedents and examples that could pave the way for them. So there's not many female scholarly mentors that could take them on. And this is very much a problem with a lot of male-dominated professions, probably not just in religious leadership. I have female friends in engineering and computer science who will say that the very male-dominated nature of the profession means it's quite hard for women to break in. It's quite hard for women to get mentors and guidance and support. And also it means that profession becomes a very male space where women sometimes don't feel necessarily they have much of a voice or necessarily feel very welcome. So some of the female scholars I know have tried to create parallel spaces where they organise among themselves, just sort of female scholarly circles. One of the other issues that is definitely quite problematic in Britain, and I think among a lot of migrant communities in the West. Most Muslim communities in Europe come from a migrant background. So they have their origins in Asia, Africa, Middle East. And in many of these cultures of origin, there is a taboo around women in public space. And so many of the female religious scholars I know, even though they're super qualified and super authoritative and much more knowledgeable than a lot of their male peers, they're very shy and hesitant to take on a public role. They're very shy to self-publicize, to push themselves forward, to have a public presence. And so many of them just remain invisible. And I meet a lot of them and I tell them, you know, why don't you push yourselves forward? I mean, you're doing excellent work and so many people can learn from you. And many of them unfortunately report not necessarily, they find it a lot harder to be taken seriously by both men and women in the community. So one young female Islamic scholar I spoke to, she was serving as an Islamic teacher and counsellor in a mosque. And she told me that when there were Islamic legal questions that arose under the congregation, some female members of the congregation would deliberately go to her male peer, so that to go to the male imam or the male scholar over her, because they just didn't feel she was knowledgeable enough or qualified enough, even though she was extremely learned, and even in some cases more so than her male peers. And I've heard this many times, that sadly a lot of young female scholars are not taken seriously by their female congregants as well as their male congregants. So there is a major issue of credibility. And so that's one thing I hear very often from female Islamic scholars.
Thank you, Alyaa. Before we move on, I would like to invite our participants to please raise your questions via the chat and the Q&A, so we can weave them into our conversation as we move on. Spyridoula, when Alyaa was talking about how there has always been a presence of female scholars, but they are somehow not recognized and their credibility is not seen. And you were talking before about the prophetess Hannah from the very beginning. I was wondering what your experiences are regarding challenges, but also as you are you are our youngest FoRēL member and also a very young member in your Archdiocese, which is a blessing, I'm sure, for the entire Archdiocese, whether you want to share some kind of vision for female religious leadership in your community.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Again, just like really taking a lot from each of you. And I definitely want to kind of the point Melinda made before, of there's a lot of feeling blessed in the context that you're in too, because, and as everyone else just mentioned as well, there's a lot of women who are the trailblazers to make a lot of things possible. I'm not saying that obviously we're at the point where our faiths, I think, value both males and females in how we respond to our call as human beings to really love one another and love ourselves, right? And God foremost, obviously. But definitely even for my specific work context, I have to give a shout out to my team, who is all wonderful males, because they really, I mean, our Zoom call last week was me and 4 of them, and I'm just the only female in my department, but because of their support and they value me, they value my work, and they allow me to grow and to really try what I think is important in the ministry that I'm looking to do, obviously in conjunction with them. I think that's really crucial, and really just, I'm so blessed and grateful for them. I hope they're watching, because that's, I just want to say thank you, of course, to my team. But I think that's an important piece of this too, right? We have to do this together, at least in the Christian context, like as the full body of Christ, but also everyone as human beings, we're called to help and raise up each other, I think is so important. So I think to respond to some of the challenges, yes, I am the youngest female at the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, which is really a blessing and also a really interesting challenge. But again, I've been really blessed to not experience some of the challenges that some of the women who have come before me have had to go through. There's definitely ways we can continue to grow. And I really hear the voices of a lot of my female peers who are frustrated by the church, not knowing where to go, not knowing how to serve and to give the talents they feel that they have. And I think that's a really important thing that for me, as being at the Archdiocese and also just continuing to do ministry in different local contexts, is really important to provide those opportunities for my peers and the girls that are coming after us, the women that are coming after us too. Even just being able to recommend that girls, for example, we don't serve in the altar. Some parishes have started that, which is really cool. And I think there's more to converse about that. But for me, I was able to start reading as a young child in church. And I think that was really impactful, because it showed me that, hey, I can have a voice in the liturgical practice of the church and then outside of that too. So definitely a vision of within the institution of the church to really provide more spaces for women like myself and those who already have been doing and studying and all these things to actually be able to do ministry and really have these spaces for conversation. And God willing, that more people will actually come in. I think it's important to have more females at the Archdiocese too. I think there's a value of both males and females everywhere, right? And I think it's important that the support is on both sides.
Thank you, Spyridoula, for mentioning this important bit of support and recognition, which Alyaa had addressed as well.
May I say one more thing about the challenge to be a female priest.
Of course, go ahead.
Or female pastor. For me, there's like, I'm of course accepted in my own church, but like in the whole union to be accepted, and that my voice and what I think and what I have to say, and that could be different from a man's perspective. This is for me really, really a challenge. And on the other hand, it's so interesting to see when I look in the like secular society, they accept me more as a like discussion partner than my own brothers in faith. So this is also like a challenge for me.
Right, so you would say that there's a difference between like secular expectations towards religious communities and the inner religious circles, right? And different nuances also of recognition.
Yes, sometimes. So when I talk to a journalist or somebody and they accept me and my voice as a female pastor, and sometimes I talk to some other pastors or other church members, and they would say, no, you're a woman, they should treat you as a sister, but I won't. So this is like really, they would never say that like this, but this is like it felt. And sometimes it hurt more, sometimes less.
Yeah, it's a delicate topic to talk about these difficult experiences also of a lack of recognition and a lack of, equality, maybe, in some sense. Melinda, I was wondering whether you would like to share your vision coming from the difficulties that we see and the lack of recognition. What could we do? What do you think is needed to get more recognition among our religious peers, but also maybe from other interfaith and secular, neighbors?
I think conversation is really the basis of it, that when we encounter pushback or encounter what we feel is a lack of recognition and acknowledgement, is to open up a conversation and to explore with open curiosity of where the person is coming from, and to be satisfied that we're never going to agree on everything. I think about some of my Orthodox colleagues who, though I would never be their rabbi, they acknowledge me as a rabbi to my community. And that, I think, is the ideal that we're going for, where we can understand that different communities will have different interpretations of what a leader means and the role that men and women play, and that there will always be communities where men and women have different public leadership roles, and to be tolerant of that, and to say and allow for and make the space where we can acknowledge that as that is the community's decision, and that and then the respect and honor another community's decision to make a female leadership, and perhaps to communicate that, that like I don't perhaps some feel threatened by like a woman rabbi. I'm not gonna force my belief on someone who doesn't believe that women should be ordained or should be leading prayers. I think I've been to many beautiful congregations where women are behind what's called mechita, behind a separation, which is not some place that I plan on praying all the time, but I can appreciate the beauty of that community and that community's decision to do that. So both, and also keep our strengths within us, that we are in the place where we should be, and that when someone doesn't acknowledge our leadership, that perhaps it has more to do with them than it is to do with us. So back to the vision is really the open communication and curiosity and acceptance of our different ways of leading communities.
Thank you, Melinda. I think that's such an important contribution to respect our different traditions and to respect the different spaces that we're in, but to still continue the conversation out of interest, of genuine interest and respect for the other. And probably we will never find like a common ground and a common sense of what female religious leadership is, and I don't think we need to. But I rather think it's good to have a close look at individual settings and at certain specific traditions and see what their what their space is and what their situation is. And so I was wondering, Alyaa, because we had a kind of like a question like that from our participants, from your research, what kinds of spaces do you see where female religious leadership flourishes? What are maybe like the outside conditions? Because you've mentioned also like female engineers having similar troubles. So is there a link maybe to a generational shift or something else, or maybe also town and rural difference, things like that?
Yeah. So interestingly, my research shows that there is a gradual feminization of Islamic education and Islamic religious institutions. And what I mean by this is that over the last century, the traditional education systems in the majority Muslim world were pretty much dismantled during the colonial period. And you now have most families, or in a lot of cultures, will want to send their sons to do careers which are very high status and will get a lot of money, like to become a doctor or a businessman or an engineer or whatever. And so you have a lot less demand from religious seminaries and religious education institutions for people enrolling, particularly people who are wanting to really kind of make an impact. And so what you have is a lot of Islamic religious education institutions are getting a lot more female enrollment than male enrollment. So what's happening now is we've got a lot of young Muslim women graduates from religious institutions that are now entering society and taking on roles and creating roles where they are transmitting Islamic knowledge, teaching, mediating legal disputes, and so there is a social shift, and consequently there is also underway a cultural shift. And I think, and I hope it will continue, that there will be more of a normalization of women in Islamic religious leadership positions.
Thank you, Alyaa, for your thoughts and your reflections about that. Spyridoula has just told me that there's a question from the audience which you would like to address, and I invite you, Spyridoula, to just mention the question yourself and address it. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mia. Thanks Angelina in the chat and the Q&A for addressing the question of talking about some of these issues that women need to be more present in these spaces in an open and critical way. And specifically, and more of that question you can see in the Q&A, but I just want to respond to that, as I totally agree. And the example I brought up of the Virgin Mary, at least in the Orthodox Church, I think for me is a model of where we should be going, right? Like women are considered so high in the tradition of the Orthodox Christian Church. So why are we not there? So I think in that same way, and I know I have these conversations with my friends, and it needs to be in an institutional sense too, I agree. And I think on the parish level too, we're not having conversations about, hey, as a female, what can I do? Like, as I said, for me, it's been a huge blessing that I was able to be at the Archdiocese, but that's not an opportunity most of my peers have. And so I think this, FoRēL, is actually part of this way of starting to break down the conversation, then inviting each of us to bring it to our own communities too, right? As an Orthodox Christian female, I talk about it with my priest, with the group that I'm part of, with my young adult group. So, and I also think at the Archdiocese, for example, or in other institutional contexts, it's important. And I think we also need to have compassion and love, but also be strong in it too, right? The women martyrs and the women saints that we celebrate in our church were unfaltering in following Christ. In the same way, like, how can we really replicate and model that example of what we feel called to minister to the people around us in all of our contexts today? So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I totally agree. And I think these are the conversations that are crucial and important. and also the work that we continue to do in recognizing the women and the men that do this work to make it happen.
Thanks, Spyridoula. Listening to you and about the importance of role models and of examples, I was thinking about Mira. If you as a female pastor have maybe a girl in your congregation and she wants to become a pastor, what kind of advice would you give her so she maybe might face less conflicts, or is there any way to avoid these or how to confront them?
So talking about role models, of course, there are some role models, but not so many. And for myself, as a younger female pastor 5 years ago, and also now, of course, I have some female mentors, but there's also the point where it's like, I don't want to be like them. And for me, I saw the chance and would say to a younger future female pastor to take the chance to live in a time that you can become your own role model. So there's a lot of strength to see people and to try to become like them, but it's also a gift, and there's power to say, oh, there's freedom when there are not so many role models. So this is how I try to get in them, to say, okay, like when I look at my great colleagues, they try to be like the old man pastor, speaking in their voice when they read the Bible like this. And so I don't have to do it, and I can find my own way. And of course, I've been influenced by other persons too, but try to see the freedom, and yeah, follow your heart and be as strong as possible. And sometimes you have to cry too, and that's fine. And always remember, Jesus starts, like from my perspective, Jesus starts his own, Jesus starts to spread the gospel with women. And his first word after the resurrection was, "Woman, why are you crying?" And so take this for the dark hours and go forward.
Thank you, Mira. And if I may interpret your contribution, you find your role models both within yourself, but also in your context and from the Bible, which is really inspiring. Melinda, as we move slowly but steadily towards the end of this first official webinar part of our conversation, I was wondering well, you can choose actually what question you prefer to answer, either the one about role models, both within your religious scriptures and tradition or in your context, or whether you want to choose the advice part, what kind of advice you would, being yourself a role model, give to those who follow you.
I put some of my advice in the last question that I answered about not taking things so personally, and to see opportunities for conversation in terms of when you think that someone's perhaps attacking you, that instead turn around and see if there's a place to engage there. In terms of my role models, I get really from all over. Both male, female, clergy, non-clergy, I really look to, my biggest role models are ones that I see people who are living out and see that all humans are created in God's image, whether they believe in God or not. That's really what I strive to be, is to seeing humanity in each one of us and interacting on that level. And again, I found those both in a religious context with my current director, Rabbi Bob Caplain, and with a growing relationship I have with a woman, Donna Hicks, who did a lot of conflict resolution, speaks about the dignity inherent in every human being and how to live that out. And I look to a lot of biblical characters too, with all their flaws, especially Moses, especially at this time, because in the Jewish cycle of reading, we just read the 10 Commandments, and really we're at a time of really speaking about the nuances of Moses's leadership, and one of the things that I loved about this past the Parsha, the portion of the Torah that we read in this past Shabbat, is it begins with Moses's father-in-law, who was a Midianite priest, coming to join the Israelites, and after acknowledging the awesomeness of God and offering a Thanksgiving sacrifice, Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, turns to Moses after seeing him work day and night to judge the people, saying, "Are you crazy? Why are you doing this all yourself?" And says, "You need to find wise, trusted people to judge also," and puts together basically a structure of courts that many of our courts are modeled after. And that has always inspired me, of one of Moses taking guidance from all outside of his community, and realizing you can't take it on all yourself, and that there are those around us that can help support you, and you do not have to do it yourself. Even Moses didn't.
Yeah, thank you, Melinda. What an inspiring thought, right? Even Moses didn't do it on himself, so why do we have to, or why do we think we have to? I'd like to summarize some questions and post them all at once to you, Alyaa. No, but in a really reduced way, before we need to close down slowly. So there were several questions about the context of what brings religious leadership to the forefront, right? What makes it a question? And I was just wondering, out of 3 options maybe, and you can just delve into the option that you prefer. Is it maybe a secular female leadership also that supports religious leadership? Or is it maybe some kind of, inner theological, inner religious movement that is a kind of rereading of our traditions? Or is it maybe a specific historical circumstance that we're in that makes more female religious leadership possible? So go whatever direction you want to, and you will have kind of the final content-based word before Kirin will give us some comments and closing remarks on how to move on. Thank you, Alyaa.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. If I can share 2 reflections, firstly as a Muslim woman and secondly as a researcher. As a Muslim woman, I would really like everybody to support and promote and just generally encourage Muslim women scholars and other women religious scholars in their fields. And my vision is really a hope that we will have a greater cultural shift to accept and normalize female religious leadership in our community. And secondly, as a researcher, I think it's really important to understand diverse historic and cultural narratives, because in the Islamic tradition, as opposed to the Judeo-Christian tradition, there was never really any, women weren't really barred from religious qualifications and religious scholarly leadership positions. And so it's a very different debate in the Islamic world about what kind of leadership and positions women can take in public space. And interestingly, in Islamic history, there was more limitations on women being political leaders than on women being religious leaders. Whereas in European history, it's been the opposite. There have been a number of women as queens and political leaders, whereas there's been historically a lot of hesitation and limitation on women being religious leaders, such as priests and rabbis. So it's just really important to understand, to avoid being Eurocentric, and just understand that history doesn't always follow the same kind of linear narrative of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that there's just so much diversity out there.
Thank you, Ali. That's such an important reminder. And thank you also to all of you wonderful panelists. At least me personally, I've learned a lot from this beautiful conversation. And I would like to invite Kirin now to, well, lead us on.
Yes, we're closing down this part of the webinar now. So I'd just like to start by thanking everyone that's here, all of our attendees who've posed such wonderful questions and been so engaged through the process. I'd like to thank our panelists, our moderators, and everyone working in the background on the FoRēL team. The value, I hope, of this whole FoRēL initiative is to both reflect on where we came from, our own traditions, our own faith trajectories, and also learn and get more context from people of other faiths and other traditions, different cultural backgrounds and narratives that they bring to the table. I think it helps us to understand how complex our religious histories are and how complex the history of gender is. So I have learned a lot from each and every person on this panel today, and I just want to thank you all for being here. A housekeeping issue, the meet and greet webinar, or not webinar, session, yes, that's going to take place after this. We will post once again the link to that room if you would like to join us, and just click on that link, copy paste it into your browser, and join us if in the next room if you want to talk more, if you have a desire to have more conversation, more exchange, and so on. It may take us a few minutes to get set up, just to decide how many people are there, if we need breakout rooms, how many breakout rooms there will be. But the idea is to make FoRēL both a learning platform, a platform for personal reflection, and a networking platform. So we hope that you can get to know each other, have some good discussions with the panelists and with the other attendees, and just have a good 20 to 30 minutes of good, clean fun. So thank you all. Really glad that you're here, and we hope to see some of you in the next few minutes. Thank you.